Okay, hello again. So, yeah, let's talk about the game loop because game loop and events. Because this is how not just how Game Maker works, but how any game works. So that's the game loop. And yeah, if you understand this, it's gonna make it much easier for you to understand programming, basically. So here's what happens every second, not just once, but 30 times if your game updates 30 times per second, or 60 times per second if you want to have a frame rate of 60 in Game Maker Studio. Now there's more details to it with the way the game loop works, but I'll explain the most important things. So when you create an object, you can have a bunch of events. In the step event, you can have the step, the begin step, and the end step event, and I'll explain what these do. And there's the draw events. Those are the most important things. The create event is also important, but the create event is very simple. It's where you place all your important variables that you want to access later. So that's all the create event is, and it happens as soon as an instance is created. And what this means, you don't need to remember that now, but what it means is if you were to create an instance, uh, if you did that, uh, if I created the game loop, the object game loop, it will create an infinite number of this object because this is what happens in the create event. So never do this because it's gonna crash. Um, Actually, why not test it? Let's see what happens. Yeah, so that's what happens. That's basically when something calls itself to do the same thing, more or less. So if you keep hearing about recursion, that's not exactly it, but it's pretty similar. Anyway, that's not the point. If you create an instance, the create event, what's in the create event, will run immediately. So let's say that you want some important variable to be equal to 0 for this instance. Right after creating it, what you will do is grab it, access the name of the variable, and set it to 0. You could modify it immediately after, and now it's going to be equal to 0. So you don't need to remember that right now, but later when you're a bit more into well, as you learn, you'll remember this information, so you'll know how to handle it. But you remember it passively. You don't need to think about that. You'll know when you need to know this. You'll remember. So don't worry about it. It's not important for now. So that's the create event. And yeah, so there's a step event, begin step, end step, draw event, draw end, draw begin. So let's go back to the game loop explanation. And okay, so what is a game loop? That's basically what happens all the time until you quit the game, and that's true for any software, any program. In the case of a game, what you do, or in the case of Game Maker, what you do is with each object in the game, run the step begin event. This is basically the first step event. There are three. There could be 10 if your games wanted to have 10 step events. There could have been. So that's basically up to the programmers. So first, run the step begin event with all objects in the game. Once that's done, only after go back to the first object, run the step event, and then do this again with all the other objects. Once that's done, once all the objects have run their normal step event, go back to the first object, run the step end event, and do this with all the others. By the way, object is not the right term, excuse me, instance would be the right term, instance. And that's why it's instance count, instance create, instance activate. It's because it's not an object we're talking about, it's an instance of an object. So the object is basically all the code related to something, and instances are basically copies of that code. That's one way to think about it. So yeah, object could be the structure of something, the structure of how a dog is made, and then all the dogs themselves, the actual animals in the game, those are instances. So that's the difference between an object and an instance. The programmer creates the object, and the program creates the instances. Yeah, I guess that's one good way to put it. Okay, so after everything has been updated, all the step events have been ran, you do the same thing with drawing to the screen. So you go with each object. If there's something in the draw begin event, does that first. Maybe you want to draw the shadow first. I'll explain to you why it's important that those are separate. Maybe you draw the shadows first. You draw some type of shadow blob under the characters. Once that's done, all the shadows have been drawn. You go back and you draw the actual character, the actual sprite. And then maybe you want to draw the health bar of the characters, right? Maybe that's what you want to do. So then you would go back and draw the health bar on top of all the enemies. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you would use the draw end event for, but you could. So maybe shadows below the enemies, and then the enemies on top of the shadows, so that you don't have the shadow of a creature on top of another creature. The shadows will only be below the creatures. So that's one way you could use this. For the step event, in the step end event, maybe you want to move, maybe you want your creatures to decide where they're gonna go first, and then only in the step event you move them. Normally you don't need to do that, but maybe in some game you would need to do that. Depends on the game, depends on how you want to go about things. One that can be useful is after you've moved your entities, your player, whatever it is, then maybe you move the screen, the camera or the view of the game. So the player moves first, and after that's done, you move the camera. That's gonna avoid the camera moving behind the player. So it's gonna avoid delays. So sometimes the order of things is important. Again, you don't need to remember all of this right now, but it's something that you might need in the future, so it's good to know right now. It's going to avoid problems and you'll know solutions to simple problems in the future. Um, I'll have to teach another event that is important and it's going to save you some headache. The cleanup event. The cleanup event happens whenever you try to destroy or remove an instance. Again, you don't need to remember this right now if you're just getting started, but you'll know if you need it in the future. Let's say the player has a weapon that's another object, another instance, and when the player dies, you want the gun to disappear. Maybe when the enemy dies, um, you want its weapon to disappear as well. Then in the cleanup event, you could do instance destroy my weapon, for example. So automatically, when the creature will be destroyed, its weapon will be deleted as well. So you can use a cleanup event for that. There are other uses that I won't teach about right now, but that's a good example of it. So that's pretty much all you need to know. I'll teach the draw GUI event as well, just in case you need it. The UI events, or they're basically on top of everything else. They're on top of everything else, but they're also always in the same position, and that's the screen basically. So 0, 0 is always going to be on the top left corner of the screen. Even if you're moving far to the right in the game with your player, the player goes way below to the right of the map. Doesn't matter. If you draw something at 0, 0, it's still going to be in the corner of the screen. It's still going to be visible. So UI events are relative to the screen, not to the game world, to the screen. So uh, I guess I'll teach you about other events as well. User events, you can use them for custom things. Maybe, well, they're basically like step events, but you decide what happens in them. So I've used them a lot before, but now I use script instead because you can't give them a name. So yeah, room start event can be useful when you basically start a room or start a game. But the most important are really the step events and the draw events and the cleanup event if you need to delete something. So I think that's enough information for the basics of a game loop. So again, with all objects, step begin. With all the objects, the normal step event. With all the objects, end step event. And then the same thing for the draw events. And you can use the order of things when maybe you need the player to move first before you update something else. Maybe it's weapons position. Maybe something else. So sometimes the order is important, and that's why it's there. Is because sometimes you can use it. So that's it for the game loop and the events.